Hey everybody, this is Tim. I'm the editor over at managersresourcehandbook.com, where you can visit us and find all sorts of tools, tips, and articles pertaining to managing teams and leading in today's business environment. I wanted to talk to you today a little bit about negotiating in China. Now, I've personally spent about the last 7 years or so working with Chinese companies and over in China. And earlier this year, I had the opportunity to lead a large negotiation for my company over in China, and had several tips and takeaways that I wanted to share with you. So, without further ado, let's get right on in it. Tip number one: know your position. This is really not something special to China. This is really just general negotiation strategy, but still, I wanted to include it here. You don't want to go in cold. You want to make sure you spend time getting your team aligned and up to speed. You want to make sure you get your negotiating team aligned. Team members should know things like the basic terms behind the deal, the financials, the scope, the timing, etc. Things that ultimately give them an understanding of what the deal is about. You want to make sure they are aware of any sensitive issues or things you just generally don't want to bring up into the negotiations or discuss. Certainly, you want to let them know about any sort of giveaways, things they're willing to do to make sure that the deal works out. Things that you can offer up as part of exchange for something else from the Chinese company, things like that. You also want to make sure you highlight any non negotiable items, things you just simply aren't willing to do as part of this contract. Additionally, things like limitations and constraints you might have on your side. For example, you're willing to take on the project, but you just simply can't get it done in the time period that they're asking for. Maybe you need some longer duration or a longer schedule, things like that. You also want to make sure your team's aware of the walk away position, ultimately the position that you're just simply willing to go to, down to, or up to, but nothing beyond that. So you want to make sure people are aware of your walk away stance. Keep in mind there's many ways and combinations of offerings to reach an agreement. So really going through this list, in detail with your team and making sure everybody knows what is and is not on the table as far as negotiating is really advantageous to you. I highlighted something down there at the bottom, which happened to my team, in fact. And I was really glad we went through and got prepared because our team got split up as part of our negotiations in the interest of time. And so I felt a lot more comfortable knowing that the people in the other room knew what they could and could not offer up as part of the negotiation. Tip number two: bring a team that's experienced in China. The cultural differences between the West and doing business over here is significantly different than what it's like to do business in China. And you may have heard this before, but I cannot emphasize it enough. A lack of awareness of these issues and these differences between doing business in these two parts of the world can significantly impact your ability to close a deal. If you walk in all sorts of cowboy style and trying to tell them how it's going to be, you're going to really ruin your chances of successfully reaching an agreement. So instead, you're going to need a indirect style, and it takes a lot of experience in China to really learn how to develop this style and to do it right. Relationships are critical to business in China, and you want to make sure you have a team with you that knows how to forge and develop these relationships in terms of working with your customer or your client or your supplier. Additionally, experience communicating through translators can be advantageous to you. Knowing how to communicate certain concepts and knowing how to interpret information through a translator is not as easy as it seems. And so you want to make sure you have a team that's experienced and versed in doing this type of thing. Speaking of translators, tip number three: have a translator who's familiar with your subject matter. As I was just saying, communicating through translators can be difficult. You want to make sure you use a translator who's familiar with your subject matter. You don't need an expert. You don't need a PhD in a given topic to sit there and translate for you. But you do want somebody who has some familiarity with what you're talking about. So, for example, if you're discussing technical matters, you want to have a translator who has a technical background. If you're discussing financial matters, you want to have a translator who's familiar with, financial terms and numbers and those sorts of things. Ultimately, you want to avoid educating your translator while you're in the negotiating room. You want to spend time talking to the other party and minimizing the amount of time you're trying to explain things to your translator. Okay, tip number 4, get there early. FaceTime is extremely important in China. Unlike here in the West, you really don't want to attempt to negotiate anything through email. It just doesn't work over there that way. Certainly have some early phone calls to explore the business relationship and make sure that it's, legitimate and it sounds like what it is you're looking for. But you don't want to just try to do it remotely. Travel to China early on in the relationship. China does respond very well to first movers, those people that are in organizations that are willing to come there and sit down with them across the table and talk to them and meet with them. They do respond very well to that. It also gives you the ability to influence in your favor or in your way of doing things. For this negotiation earlier this year, in my case, we were actually the second company involved for a number of reasons, but it definitely created some hurdles for us as we were trying to undo what our competitor had done and to try to, I'll say, re-educate or realign our customers' expectations in our favor or in terms of what we wanted to do as part of the contract. So ultimately, you want to get there early, despite the cost of traveling to China. Time spent there with the other party really should be seen as an investment into the relationship and not an expense. Tip number 5, agreements are made at very high levels. So relationships at high levels can outweigh lower level practicalities. What made my particular negotiation interesting this year was the fact that some very high level executives in my company and in our customers, in this case, had come to an agreement with the scope to be defined. And that was my job to go figure out what the scope would actually be. So sometimes, those high level relationships can go make agreements on your behalf, essentially, that you then have to go and work through. So you want to make sure as part of your negotiation that you bring team members that are going to match the level of seniority of the counterparts, as additional agreements may need to be made during your visit. High-level representation also shows commitment from your side to the Chinese, and this is a very important detail. If you just send a bunch of beginners, I'll say, junior employees, that's not going to show the level of support that the Chinese company is going to be looking for from you. Tip number 6, be prepared for anything. While formality is important when working in China, the lack of structure is typical of doing business in China. Is a little bit different than doing business over here in the West. So you want to prepare an agenda for your negotiation meetings just like you would any meeting back home. But you also want to make sure you have all topics ready to discuss. And do not be surprised if in the first 5 minutes as you're reviewing the agenda, if it changes. This has happened to me many, many times where I go through the agenda and before I finish the agenda slide, there is new topics added, there's some topics removed, the order is changed, etc. So you want to make sure that you're prepared to talk to a number of topics. Don't be afraid to defer any topics if needed to get emails overnight. Sometimes you just simply don't have the information. Rather than try to, wing it, certainly don't be afraid to say, hey, look, maybe we can talk about that tomorrow. Go back to your hotel and send some emails and get some answers early in the morning before you go back into the negotiating room. You want to be agile. Come prepared, as I said, to discuss any number of items. You want to have presentations, pictures, lists, anything as much as you can available to facilitate the conversation, again, between the language barrier and the tendency for meetings to kind of stray off in tangents. You want to be prepared as possible to make it productive. So, for example, if you're in some early discussions about a possible production deal with the Chinese, you want to prepare things like some of the adjacent topics. For example, shipping logistics, order placement, factory inspections, etc. Even if those aren't really part of the planned dialogue, you want to be prepared to talk about them. Finally, negotiations can go long, they can go late, and they can be physically challenging. We were convinced during our negotiation that the Chinese company left the air conditioning system off, and it got really warm in the room until we conceded on something, and suddenly it started to cool off in there. So, really be prepared for anything. Tip number 7: prepare for fast but anticipate slow. As I mentioned during the negotiations for my contract earlier this year, there was a high level agreement that was made that quickly sealed the deal. They had agreed to a price, and we were literally told, "We've agreed to financial terms. We will work out the details later." And my job was to negotiate all the details. So this is certainly possible. Lightning fast deals can occur in China, but typically speaking, progress is slower, and it's more typical to go slow, and you should expect it to go slow. Once again, it's about the relationship. Some advice I got a long time ago, which has typically been the case with my own personal experiences working in China. It'll often take about 3 meetings to really start feeling like you're making progress. Your first 1, 2, maybe even 3 meetings, it feels like you're not getting anywhere, and this is not uncommon. You need to stick with it and anticipate that it's going to take a little bit of time to start working through the details. Okay, tip number 8: clearly align payment terms. Unlike here in the West, milestone payments are not as common in China, and while they can be more typical of what you'd find here in the West, milestones just simply aren't really the case in China. Chinese companies, they may have a concern that you won't stick around. That's why they tend not to like the concept of milestones. Again, it's about the relationship. The concern may be, and I've seen this before, that if they pay you your money at such and such time, that you're just going to walk away. You got your money for the effort up to that point, and that is a concern for them. So milestone payments are a bit tricky. So you want to set any sort of progress payments terms as tightly as possible to milestones. And you want to make sure that those milestones are defined in writing. Don't assume that your definition of some sort of milestone is the same definition that they would interpret, or at least, that don't expect them to have the same interpretation. So you want to put it in writing exactly what the milestone is. You also want to minimize the potential for the other party to have control, which typically makes sense, right? But in China, it's not uncommon for a single open action item, for example, to be used essentially against you to hold up a $2 million payment. It could be a simple thing that just hasn't gotten done, or something that's open, and your payment of, say, $2 million may be held up for that. So that is not uncommon. So you want to minimize the potential in your negotiations for anything to be in their control. You also want to align any payments and milestones to milestones and to calendars as best as possible in your contract. So, for example, you may want to put a statement in there like $2 million payment to be made upon completion of design submittal, or July 2016. That way, if there's any sort of delays or issues that pop up, you at least have some sort of contractual statement that refers to a time period. It's not uncommon for things to get delayed when doing business in China, and you do not want to suffer the delay of payments and your financial pieces of your contract being delayed as a result of other delays. You want to try to tie it to a calendar, especially if you're performing on your end and they're not performing on their end. Finally, you want to consider any default or delay penalties on them. We managed to get this in our contract, and this is particularly useful if you're working in an immature industry in China. Penalties on them may help reduce the risk of the previous items from happening. It also kind of incentivizes them, I'll say, to make sure that they're fulfilling their end of the bargain. Again, it helps minimize the amount of power that they have. So any default and delay penalties on them can help you minimize any sort of delays cost-wise. Okay, tip number 9, showcase your strengths. All the experience I've had working with Chinese companies, I can tell you they all seem to have a lot of cash. Cash, although money is important, what they really value is knowledge and experience. They want to partner with companies who provide the greatest value and the lowest risk to them. They want you to bring your experience and knowledge to them, and they want to pay, and they're willing to pay for it, but you need to show them what they're going to be getting. So as part of your negotiations, at any given time, you want to be prepared to discuss your experience. You want to be able to present your breadth of knowledge. Even if you're a big name brand, a big company, with a worldwide recognized, logo or something, assume they've never heard of you before, and be prepared to walk them through what it is you do and demonstrate how you can help them. This was very important for us. We showed them what the work we do, how we do, the design work that we do for them, and they really valued it. They really were in tune with what it was that we would do. Even though they knew our company name, they were very interested in this sort of thing, and it helped us secure the contract. When you're working in China, recognize that they're masters of learning. They ask very good questions. This is both to learn, but also to evaluate your ability to bring them long-term value. Okay, so showcase your strengths. Number 10, be respectful of seniors. Seniority and hierarchy are a big deal in China. Make sure you never put a senior member of the Chinese company in a bad position, especially in front of their lower-ranking colleagues. You want to let the Chinese leaders save face. So if you have a, conversation that's not going well, rather than criticize the leader, the senior members across the table from you, maybe take it out into the hallway, have a private discussion later, but be very cognizant of their rank. You want to make sure they can save face. Any outward criticism or aggression towards their, or aggressive style, I should say, are going to ruin your chances of securing a deal. You need to let them, again, save face. You want to make sure you don't put them in a position where they feel inferior. Finally, names and introductions can be difficult in a large meeting. Time and time again, I've had people come into meetings without introductions and then leave again. Half the time you don't really know who you're talking to in terms of rank and position. So general rule of thumb, show respect for everybody. Even if they ask silly questions, assume it's the best and most important question you've ever been asked. Okay, so be very respectful. And if you don't know who they are, just, don't forget the rank. Just assume they're all high-ranking people. Tip number 11. Finally, remember it's about courtship. Doing business in China is all about relationships. Your first dealings with the Chinese company are going to take longer, require a longer negotiation phase. Don't expect to finalize a deal on one business trip, and you should really plan to return and structure your negotiations accordingly. Don't try to pack it all into 2 or 3 days. It's better to, and you should assume that you're going to be coming back anyway. It's better to get through at a pace that's manageable, and expect to come back. Expect to walk away with actions and questions and things you need to go back and discuss internally and come back to the negotiation table. The bigger the deal, obviously, the longer it's going to take for the romance. So, again, it's about building the relationship. So prepare to show patience. It's generally not going to happen overnight, as I said earlier. So you want to make sure you're patient and prepared for it to take a while for that relationship to grow and for that deal to be finalized. Okay, so that's it. Negotiating in China. Visit us on the web at managersresourcehandbook.com. If you go to our recommended reading page at the top, you will also find some more resources for doing business in China. If you have any questions about working in China or questions about doing business over there, certainly just jump on our website and send us an email, and I'd be glad to answer any questions that I can. Have a great day.